We're starting with part 2 of our introduction to the skeletal system, and we're going to start out with hematopoietic tissue in the bones. Now, the hematopoietic tissue is going to be the red bone marrow. It's going to be found within the trabecular cavities of the spongy bone on the ends of the long bone and the dipoli of the flat bones. In infants, it's going to be found in all of the medullary cavities and areas of spongy bone. And remember, as they grow, that does change over into yellow bone marrow. But when they're infants, it is going to be red bone marrow. Adults, it's restricted to the flat bones, and they're going to be found at the ends. So it can be found at the proximal epiphyses of the humerus and the femur. So when bone development occurs, you're going to have something known as ossification, or often referred to as osteogenesis. So bone tissue formation begins at around 2 months of development. And so postnatal bone growth and remodeling repair are going to be very common. These are going to be things that the body will continue to do throughout the person's life. And we're going to talk about 2 specific types of bone development. First, you have your endochondral ossification. And so basically there, the bone forms via replacement of hyaline cartilage. And so as that bone ossification starts to occur, the bone tissue starts to move in. It's going to break down that cartilaginous tissue, and it's going to replace it. The skeleton of an infant and a fetus is going to be made up mainly of cartilage, or what's referred to as endochondral bones. Those are cartilage bones or cartilaginous bones. And so it will develop into actual bone or go through the ossification process as that child grows and develops. And so at first, this is going to form most of the skeleton of the child. Now with endochondral ossification, it begins at primary ossification centers, which are going to be in the center of the hyaline cartilage shaft of that fetal skeleton. Blood vessels are going to infiltrate the perichondrium, and that's going to convert it into what's known as periosteum. From there, that change in nutrition is going to allow that underlying cell to change into osteoblasts. And remember, osteoblasts are going to be the cells that are going to secrete the hard matrix of the bone. So it's going to have that hydroxyapatite, which is going to be the calcium and phosphate salts that it's going to deposit along the fibers that you're going to find that make up that skeleton there. And so we can look at this picture. First, what starts to happen is that it's all made of hyaline cartilage, and you're going to see that primary ossification center right here start to form. And so that bone collar is what is referred to as on the edge here. It's going to form around the diaphysis of the hyaline cartilage, and then in the center, you're going to have that primary ossification start to occur. Next, the cartilage in the center of that diaphysis is going to calcify and then develop into cavities. So we see the start of our medullary cavity right there. So it's just going to continue to ossify and continue to develop. Next, you're going to have the periosteal bud, which is going to invade the internal cavities and the spongy bone. And so it's going to come in, hold on just a moment. You're going to see how it's going to come in through here. And so now you're going to have these arteries and vessels that invade that medullary cavity. And they eventually start to work their way up to where the spongy bone is going to begin to form on the ends. Next, you have the diaphysis, which is going to elongate, and the medullary cavity is going to be completely formed there now. And then secondary ossification centers are going to start to appear in the epiphyses. And so we see these secondary sections here, and yes, that's where that spongy bone is starting to form. You have this compact bone, which is formed along here where that bone collar was. Now you have that good opening for that medullary cavity, and you see where the vessels have started to invade that area and started to feed that bone tissue. And then next, you have where the epiphyses, or each epiphysis is going to start to ossify. And so remember, those are going to be the ends here. And so as they ossify, you're going to put that spongy bone there in the middle. it's going to be surrounded on the outside by that compact bone. And then through the center here, I kind of drew over it with the last one, is going to be your epiphyseal plate. Now, since I called it an epiphyseal plate, that is going to be cartilage, and that's going to be found in the bone of somebody who has not finished growing. And so once we refer to it as an epiphyseal line, remember, that epiphyseal line, that person's finished growing, that bone is not going to go through any more lengthening. Now, it can remodel itself, remember, and become wider and have a wider girth, but it's not going to become longer in length. Here you can see, looking at the fetus, it's a 12-week-old fetus. The red areas are going to represent bone that's forming and has calcified. The clear areas are going to represent cartilage or uncalcified areas. And so look at the fetus's wrist, especially. Hold on just a minute, like right here. Notice how you don't see any of those carpals there. You have 8 wrist bones, and you don't notice any of those have formed yet. Also, the metacarpals have not extended yet, and then the phalanges are just starting to form. Our second type of bone formation is going to be your intramembranous ossification. Now, this type of ossification or bone development is going to form what's referred to as fibrous membrane or membrane bones. Now, with these type of bones, these are going to be mostly referred to as things like your flat bones. So there'll be your clavicle, which is going to be your collarbone, things like your cranial bones, and even your sternum. Right here in this picture, you see how this membranous bone forms. So first off, you're going to have the development of ossification centers. And so here we have these osteoblasts starting to secrete their organic matrix there. So this center part is your ossification center, and these are going to be your osteoblasts. Remember, they're secreting the hydroxyapatite, the calcium phosphorus salts, onto those collagen fibers in order to make that hard matrix. Next, you're going to come over and calcification has started to occur. So that calcium and other minerals are then deposited on the extracellular matrix, and it's actually starting to harden. So over the first one, you saw it starting to form. The second one, it has formed and it's starting to harden and fill in. Coming down to the third picture, you have the formation of the trabeculae. That's going to take extracellular matrix, which is going to develop into the trabeculae and then fuse to form that spongy bone. Remember, the spongy bone is going to be found through the center of that flat bone. And then coming on over to the fourth picture, you see the development of the periosteum. And there you're going to have that mesenchyme at the periphery of that bone. It's going to develop into that periosteum. And so that periosteum is going to be here. Peri just means around. Oste is bone, so it's going to be around that bone area there. And so you see what you know as a flat bone because it has that spongy bone through the center. It's going to have the compact bone across the top and the bottom, and then it's going to have the membranous tissues that are surrounding it. Right, with the interstitial growth or growth and length of the bones, it's going to require the presence of that epiphyseal cartilage. So in order for it to lengthen, remember, you have to still have a growth plate there, and that growth plate is made of cartilage. So the epiphyseal plate is going to maintain a constant thickness. And so that rate of cartilage growth is going to be on one side, and it's balanced out by the replacement on the other side. So let's say that we have that cartilage line there. And so as it grows, it gets pushed down one way and it's constantly being replaced on the other side. And so as you have cartilage cells being replaced, the other ones get pushed further away. And as they get pushed further away, that's what's going to lengthen that bone. On top of making that bone stronger or longer, you're also going to have to remodel it because it's going to have to be proportionate. So you're going to have to remodel the epiphyseal ends there, and you're going to have to remodel the diaphysis. So as it's growing longer, it also needs to match in width as well. And so it's constantly remodeling as it does this. As a result of this growth, you're going to have 5 zones within that cartilage. And we're going to look at a picture of it in just a minute, a pretty good picture. And so what we're going to look at is on one end, you're going to start off, you're going to have what's referred to as the resting zone or quiescent zone. The next zone you're going to have is what's referred to as the proliferation zone. And so that's going to be referred to as your growth zone. And then the next one's going to be the hypertrophic zone. That's where the cells are actually going to start to form within that area. Then you have your calcification zone. In that calcification zone, you're starting to see those cells change over and calcify. And then you have ossification, and that's the osteogenic zone. And that's where it's completely getting rid of those cartilaginous cells that were found in there, and it has completely changed over into bone at that point. And so looking here, you can see that we started off with the resting zone up top. Then we go into that proliferating zone. And so you see those cells undergoing mitosis. As they undergo mitosis, they're going to push that cell further down. It goes into then the hypertrophic zone. That's where those older cartilage cells are going to start to enlarge and they start to change over. Then it changes over to that calcification zone. That's where the matrix is going to calcify. Cartilage cells are going to die out. And cartilage cells, I don't know if I've mentioned before, are referred to as chondrocytes. So those chondrocytes that you see in here, let me circle. Here's some chondrocytes. So these different cells that you see in there, the chondrocytes, these are the ones that are going to start to die out as they come down. And so in this area, notice how it does not look like this area here. And then you have your ossification zone, and this is going to be the section or the zone where it's going to completely change over into that osseous tissue or into that hard bony matrix, and those chondrocytes aren't going to be there anymore. And here's another view looking at that. And so as you see that bone gets pushed downwards to lengthen it through the diaphysis, you're going to see how it changes over time. So you have that resting zone, you have the proliferating, let me get my pencil. So you have this resting zone here with the cartilage. You have the proliferating cartilage through here. This is where it starts to enlarge those cells and they start to kind of change over. Here's where it starts to calcify. And so that's going to push and lengthen that bone. And so if you come over here, you're going to see old chondrocytes are going to be replaced by the bone. So that there now became this longer section of bone. And so as it's doing this, remember, it's also having to remodel itself. So as the infant's moving or as the person's moving and it's remodeling itself, it's also making itself either thicker or it's going to make it be able to withstand certain types of stresses through that remodeling, depending on how that person walks, how that person lifts things, what they're actually doing with that limb. So here is another view looking at bone growth on the left-hand side. So you see the cartilage growing here. Bone replaces cartilage right here. Then you have the cartilage growth here at the epiphyseal plate or your growth plate. And down here, you're going to see where bone's going to be replacing that cartilage. If you come over to bone remodeling, then you're going to see how it changed. So follow the older bone here, and that is how it did look, but as it got longer, it had to remodel it in order to make it proportionate. So near the end of adolescence, your chondroblasts, which are going to be your cartilage cells, are going to start dividing less often. When it does that, that epiphyseal plate is then going to start to thin out and it becomes replaced by bone. The epiphyseal plate closure then occurs. That's where the bone lengthening is going to cease. It's no longer going to grow longer. That bone material of the epiphysis and the diaphysis are going to fuse together, so there's no longer going to be that cartilaginous line. It's just going to be bone throughout. In females, this is going to occur around the age of 18. In males, it occurs around the age of 21. That's when the growth plates start to fuse over. And remember, it's completely fused over by the age of 25. And so here, looking at this picture, I'm going to let you take a look at it for a minute. Look at the arrows. Take a look at the wrist. What type of x-ray is this? Would this be an x-ray of an adult, or would this be an x-ray of a child? If you look at those arrows are pointing at specific points that are going to be growth plates. Another way that you could tell, other than having growth plates, that this is a child's x-ray is by looking at this wrist. That's why I told you to pay attention to it. Notice how you don't know the 8 carpal bones already formed there. We have a growth plate here. We have the growth plates here. So notice those different growth plates, and by looking at the wrist, you know that this is a child's x-ray. Now look at this picture. Looking at this picture, you would know it's an adult's x-ray, mainly by looking at this picture here. My drawing needs to catch up to me. Okay, there we go. So we see the 8 carpals that are going to be formed there. Notice how the bones are all in contact with each other. They're all articulating with each other. And so notice how things come together nicely at these sections. Notice how you don't see the growth plate lines that would go through here like we did with the others. They have completely fused, and now the bone is completely ossified, and there's no more cartilage there. Oppositional growth is going to be another type of growth. That's going to be the growth in width, not in length. So this is going to allow lengthening of bone to widen. This occurs throughout your life, and it doesn't just stop when your growth spurt stops. So osteoblasts here are going to be beneath that periosteum, and they're going to secrete bone matrix onto the external bone. So they're building up that bone from the outer portion of the bone. Osteoclasts are going to be on the inside part, so the endosteal surface, and they're going to be there eating away at the older bone and removing it. When it does that, remember, it releases all those minerals and things that were found in the bone into the bloodstream, so it could circulate through the body and be reused, or it might circulate and come right back and be used by the osteoblast to build the bone on the outer portion. Usually there's going to be more building up than there is breaking down. So this is going to give us thicker and stronger bone, but not too heavy. At any given time, your body replaces about 10% of its bone a year. And so at any given time, you have a completely new skeleton in certain spots. So you can go through a 10-year period and you'll have a completely new skeleton than you had 10 years before that. All right, so looking here, we'll see how to create that bone as far as widenings. Starting out with the first one, you're going to see the ridges in the periosteum create grooves for the periosteal blood vessels. And so we see this grooving here. Next, you're going to come over and you see the periosteal ridges starting to fuse together. So we had a groove. Now they're fusing together and coming together there. Next, those osteoblasts in the endosteum are going to build new concentric lamellae, and those are going to be inward towards the center tunnel, forming a new osteon. And so we see that forming here. We see those lamellae coming through here. And then last, that bone's going to grow outward as the osteoblast and the periosteum are going to build new circumferential lamellae. And then the osteon is going to form there and repeat as the new periosteal ridges are going to fold in over blood vessels. So we see that happening, creating new osteons. Here's an osteon here. Notice the different rings of lamellae as it goes through. Notice it surrounded itself around that vessel. Remember that opening there is going to be referred to as a Haversian canal. And so looking at how bone widens over time, we see the infant's bone. Notice how it's very thin. Then we come over to the child's bone. Notice how that bone is being formed by the osteoblast on the outside. On the inside, where the medullary cavity is, you're going to see bone being destroyed by the osteoclasts. Then you look at the young adult bone, it's getting even wider and bigger, and then over to the adult bone. Results of mechanical stressors on bone, or what's referred to as Wolff's Law. Bones are basically going to grow or remodel in response to demands placed on it. So if you have a lot of weight on a bone, it's going to have to grow thicker in order to carry that weight. If you do a lot of running, it needs to be able to grow in order to support the weight or the pressure or the stresses that you're putting on that bone as you do that activity. And so this explains the hardness. Right or left-handed people results in thicker and stronger bone of that upper limb. So if you're right-handed like I am, my bone is going to be thicker on the right side and stronger versus my left-hand arm or hand. Curved bones are going to be thickest where they're most likely to buckle. So where you would think there's going to be the most stress, the most weight, or the most anything put on it, those are going to be the thickest sections. The trabeculae are going to form trusses along these lines of stress to help give it extra strength. Large bony projections are going to occur where heavy active muscles are going to attach. And the reason is it needs a nice big space for that muscle to attach to and to hold on. And then bones of the fetus and bedridden children are going to be kind of featureless. Since they haven't started to walk yet or hold their head up or use their arms, they're not going to have these structures that you find with mechanical stressors. As they begin to walk or as they begin to get well, if they're bedridden, then you'll see these structures start to form. But if somebody becomes bedridden, then you'll start to see these bones become featureless or start to lose these projections and features. All right, so looking at it, we see with this curve here, it's going to come through the head, through the neck, and then go into that body of the bone. That is going to be where you have your load coming on this section, on the head of that femur, and then that stress is going to be pushed out. You have a point of no stress right through here, and so you see the tension and compression, how they're going to work together. Here's somebody who plays tennis. If you look at their serving arm, notice how that bone is a lot thicker. It's going to have that added bone matrix that you see on the outer and inner portions. Whereas if it's a non-serving arm or their non-dominant arm, it's not going to have that. And we'll finish off today with osteoporosis. Osteoporosis is going to be found in a group of diseases where bone is going to become brittle and break down very easily. So bone reabsorption is basically going to outpace the deposit of bone onto those collagen fibers there. And so the osteoclasts are working a lot faster than the osteoblasts that are putting down the bone matrix. Spongy bone of the spine and neck of the femur are going to be the most susceptible to osteoporosis. And then you can look at the vertebral and hip fractures that are going to be common in osteoporosis. That's where we're going to end for today. We'll pick up with our next one with fractures.